petite sur la chaise, moi.
Is everybody ready? Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation?
Comme ça, c'est mieux. Vous m'entendez mieux?
Is that, oh, that's better. That's better.
Bon, j'ai pas beaucoup de succès. Hein. Là, c'est bien comme ça.
That's
voilà, très bien. Bah, écoutez, je remercie ceux d'entre vous qui
I'd like to
ont
thank
eu
those of you
la prudence de venir
were
tout de suite
cautious
après le
enough to
repas,
come right
hein,
after
pour
lunch
participer à
to
cette
participate
troisième
in the
table
third panel
ronde de
discussion
cette conférence organisée par
in
le
the
groupe 3
conference
du
organized by
Conseil
Group
économique et
3
social européen.
of the
Les
EESC.
interventions et les échanges,
The
alors, le
speeches and
titre de cette
exchanges,
table
now
ronde,
the
c'est Climat
title
et énergie,
is Climate
les
Energy,
défis géopolitiques et militaires.
the
Bonjour.
geopolitical and military challenges.
Voilà. Les interventions et les échanges qui vont se faire
The
doivent nous
exchanges that
permettre
will follow will enable us to
d'appréhender
better
les relations
understand
entre
the
changement
relationship
climatique
between
et
climate
transition
change
énergétique,
and energy transition,
d'entendre et
and to
étudier les
hear and
propositions
study
novatrices
the
susceptibles
novel
d'être versées au débat, mais
proposals
aussi d'identifier
subject
les
to
choix qui
discussion
s'offrent en termes
and the
politiques
choices
publiques
in terms of public
et
policy,
aujourd'hui,
and
de
today,
nouveaux équilibres
in the new
géopolitiques et
geopolitical
militaires,
and military
puisque nous ne
balances,
pouvons pas,
because we cannot
nous exprimer sans avoir
express
présent à l'esprit
ourselves without keeping
la
in mind
catastrophe,
the
qui
catastrophe
se produit à
currently
3 heures
underway
de chez nous.
3 hours away from here.
Le drame que vivent nos
And the drama that our
collègues, nos concitoyens,
our
nos amis,
fellow friends and
ukrainiens,
citizens in
ne
Ukraine
sera pas
are
non plus
going
sans
through.
incidence sur
And this will
les
not be without
équilibres,
incidence in any
géopolitiques et
geopolitical
sur
balance we
les
are seeking
équilibres,
and in the
environnementaux.
environmental balances
Alors,
as well.
assurer pleinement notre
So
responsabilité
to
de
ensure
membres
our
du CESE.
responsibility
Qu'est-ce que
to the
c'est?
members of the EESC, what does that mean? It means we be attentive to the players in civil society in their diversity and their singularity, in the image of our group, Group 3, and to act as a relay to clarify public what decision makers are deciding, to understand the difficulties to which citizens are confronted, with which they are confronted, and even major political results such as what Europe is going through right now, and that we do know the results of, and to relay insofar as possible proposals adapted to requirements of reality, and that they are so designed. The participation of our citizens in political decisions and analyses thereof go through our bullhorn, and we need to be aware of that. Since 1988, the diagnostics established by the Scientific Committee in the IPCC has been affirmed and refined. These forecasts were confirmed by facts and observations. The conclusions of experts were undisputable. The last preliminary report by the IPCC has just confirmed yesterday what was already underlined in August 2021, i.e., the temperature of the planet was going to increase by 1.5 degrees in 2030, or 10 years earlier than the previous forecast. So there's no more any doubt. Our planet is literally burning under our eyes. We must no longer look elsewhere. As President Chirac said at Rio, and in a recent film we saw the same thing. We need to get out of the cosmic denial faced with the climate deregulation. We have to look at it. And this is before the Russian army attacked the Ukrainians with diplomatic and energy results that will result for that, doubtless. I'd like to go back over history. Joris said that courage means going after the ideal but understanding the real, acting and giving to the right causes without knowing what the compensation will be to us, or if there is even a compensation. So we need to be collectively courageous and to understand first the real and the indispensable ecological transition of our economies will be fair, in solidarity, with solidarity, or it will not happen. In the plenary session in February, our committee adopted an opinion called Reaching the Climate Objectives of the European Union on the Horizon of 2030 via climate neutrality. All groups taken together, it was underlined that specific measures and social measures will need to be implemented to protect and support the most vulnerable citizens, given that they will be the most exposed to the consequences of the additional cost. These measures will be essential to guarantee the adhesion and the onboarding of citizens that's necessary for a transition. In another opinion devoted to sustainable growth, our committee recommended as well not to concentrate only on the ecological and digital transformation, but to take care in parallel to make concrete the social sustainability aspect. We were insisting as well on the fact that by working both in those two areas of transition, ecological and digital, which would be fair and equitable with sustainable social conditions, we would pose the foundations for prosperity and future resilience. I think it's even more true today than it was then, on the 7th day of the war in Ukraine. In other words, acceptability, the social acceptability of the transition is a condition for the success. Those that imagine that the fracture can always be assumed by the poorest are wrong. The 1% of people, the richest people in the planet, emit twice more gas than the poorest people on the earth. Now, with respect to our speakers today, they'll be talking today. I'd like it if you could get out of your area of expertise in scientific certainties and to include your thought about the social compass. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, experts, let's devote all of our energy today to meet that contemporary challenge presented to humanity, i.e. our survival. So we need to make it possible to survive, as Saint-Exupéry said. And the current events encourages us to do exactly that. I'd like to thank the three speakers who are going to be participating in this panel discussion to provide their expertise with three levels of assessment around the challenges in climate deregulation and the energy transition, as well as the consequences of the question of balance in the breakdown of energy. Jean-Michel Valantin, who is a doctor in strategic studies and a researcher in the president of the Federal Circuit of talking about contemporary military aspects having to do with these two things. In 2020, he published a work entitled The Eagle, the Dragon, and the Planetary Crisis, in which you assess the interdependency between Chinese and American powers, which would constitute one of the major forces of the ecological crisis of today. Maanavilja, who collaborates with Mrs. Delato, who is General Director of Action for Climate, will be speaking from Brussels. Attitudes of European citizens with respect to the fight against climate change and energy, transition to clean energy. And lastly, Noémie Fompeyrine, who is responsible for the Resilience Perspective Research and Innovation Division in the Department of Ecological Transition and Climate from the city of Paris. You were able to measure the breakdown and the availability of these spaces. We'll be illustrating the meaning and development of territorial action as well as the objectives followed by the municipality that welcoming us here today in this educational exchange which is here to raise awareness of young people to respond to the urgency of the environment and prepare, indeed, that acceptability that I am encouraging all of us to be attentive to. Professor Valantin, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dominique Gillot, for that extraordinary introduction. I will also thank Thierry Libat and the European Economic and Social Council for this invitation. We've mentioned this in passing, but we're going to try to establish a few main principles in terms of the link between geopolitical aspects and climate change today. As Dominique Gillot so clearly spoke about just now, this week we are in a moment of collision, quite surprising, between, on the one hand, the war led by Russia against Ukraine, and on the other hand, by the appearance of the last IPCC assessment, which determines that we have entered into a planetary area of danger. In a few minutes, I will attempt to quickly demonstrate that this collision and this link is not chronological. It has also been established in actual fact. You were speaking, Madam, about my recent works. My last book, The Eagle, the Dragon, and the Planetary Crisis, published in 2020 in the Seuil Publishing House. I'm trying to establish that there are very concrete links between geopolitics and the geophysical disturbance. If you look at the relationship between the US and China since the beginning of the 80s, we notice something very important. We notice that China, starting in the beginning of the 80s, reformed by Deng Xiaoping after the Maoist era, China have attracted industries, Japanese industries, American industries in their territory, which made it possible for them to do their industrial revolution. Now, the economic relationship between the U.S. and China was so close, and so between the 80s and the 2000s, that the British historian called Niall Ferguson even established that relationship between the U.S. and China was a relationship that was literally a hybridation of both economies, and that there's no more reason to talk about an American economy or a Chinese economy. Both economies are very deeply not only interdependent, but intermixed. And he qualifies that hybridation by chimerica. And chimerica is very concrete. But greenhouse gas emissions induced by the industrial production, both by Chinese and American, the transport, the imports, and places of exchange, and so forth, correspond literally to 45% of greenhouse gas emissions on the Earth. Okay? The only relationship between China and the U.S., which is really the engine for globalization, originates 45% of greenhouse gas emissions, almost half of the climatic problems today. I'm just mentioning this through chimerica to demonstrate to what extent the link between politics and the physical aspects are deep and profound and concrete. To develop what I want to say, In the next 5 minutes, I wanted us together to look at a case study. The first slide, please.
Même deuxième slide.
Or second slide.
Voilà, parfait. Donc, on va étudier ce qui se passe.
We're going to look at what's going on in the Arctic and the way in which global warming of the Arctic is also a geopolitical switchover, which is major, which is currently ongoing and has been for several years, and which will be very quickly an issue. As you can see on this map, the climate change's effect on the Arctic make it such that the area is heating up 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world, and that the ice sheet in the summer is reduced increasingly and is faster and faster. This reduction in the ice sheet in the summer, I'm resisting it that it's in the summer, the effect of that is that Russia has opened up a northwest passage that goes from the Bering Strait up at the top right over to Norway, Iceland, and the North Atlantic, and the bottom of the map. So that new maritime route is extremely interesting for the Asian countries, in particular for China, because it makes it possible for commercial merchandise to be transported and to reach North Atlantic and Northern Europe by saving almost 10 days of travel compared to the southern route, which went through the Malacap, Detroit, and the Suez Canal and so forth. Next slide, please. This use of the northern route is been at the origin of the very strong political and diplomatic agreements between China and Russia for more than 10 years now. President Putin and Xi meet at least 2 or 3 times a year in the framework of this Russia-China cooperation to talk about the use of the Northwest Passage by Chinese convoys. Let's get back just for a moment to the preceding slide. Now, what you really need to bear in mind when you look at this slide, and we remember that Russia and China for 10 years now have been negotiating and increasing their cooperation for that Northwest Passage. You can see here, by moving through the Bering Strait, the Chinese convoys are able to reach the North Atlantic. And due to this fact, it makes it possible for China to become a major power in the North Atlantic area, which is obviously counterintuitive, and which is obviously upsets very deeply the geopolitical balance in the world, and also the geopolitical balance in the Atlantic area. If you could move forward, that we're here. In addition to that, the Arctic area contains, doubtless, 10% of the oil reserves that are still not exploited and 20% of gas reserves which have not yet been exploited. And you will see on the horizon the first offshore platform, Russian platform in the Arctic area, the Kiswazolumni Platform, which exploits a submarine oil field. Now, this platform was placed into service around 2013-2014, and since that time, the number of joint ventures between Chinese and Russians in the area of gas and petrol continually increase. In addition to that, the Russian government has installed the northern route by opening up or developing a certain number of port cities along the northern sea route, which require new energy contributions. So the Russian government placed an order with the Russian nuclear unit, the Rosatom, a new means of developing energy. And here, what we have in front of us, our eyes, is the finalization of the first nuclear reactor that is sea-borne, which is subsequently, the mission of which is to go from one port to another along the northern route to respond to requirements in electricity as they may occur. You have to know that the development of this first nuclear reactor, which is a floating nuclear reactor, has been so successful that there are already more than 15 countries that have said they're interested in buying one or renting one. Next slide. But the development of the Northwest Passage has been accompanied by the whole military development of Arctic Siberia and the Arctic. And this has gone along with an accelerated militarization of that area. This accelerated militarization has been translated into the multiplication of military maneuvers of the Russians in that Arctic area. And in 2018, this was with a whole series of major maneuvers that took place between September and October, which translates something quite impressive. Here you see a photo taken during that military exercise in Vostok 2018. So this Vostok exercise in 2018, which was the biggest military maneuver of the Russian army since the end of the Cold War. It made it possible as well to invite units from the Chinese Liberation Army in the PRC and a few units from Mongolia as well. So in fact, practically speaking, in 2018, there were military maneuvers between Russians and Chinese in the north of Siberia, in the Arctic area. Next slide. This militarization of the Arctic area was accompanied as well by the installation of military equipment.
And this military equipment is installed either permanently or semi-permanently on the islands making up the Siberian archipelago. A number of military bases had been developed during the Cold War and are presently being restored and rehabilitated. So what we see is that you have S-400 anti-air missiles, which are exceptional weapons, and these are also being installed in the Donbas area by the Russian army. Next slide. Following the Russo-Chinese maneuvers of September 2018, end of October 2018, we saw major military maneuvers by NATO, as you can see on this picture. No, keep this slide, thank you. So these NATO military maneuvers mobilized land, air, and sea forces of the US, France, Norway, Finland, Germany, and other NATO member states. Can we come back to the map, please? The slide of the map. Fine, that's good. Now, these major military maneuvers took place in Norway and Iceland, as well as in the waters between Norway and Finland. That is to say, at the entry of the North Sea route. That is to say, the route taken by the Chinese convoys and the Russians as well to reach the North Atlantic. So what we can clearly see in recent years is the extent to which the warming of the Arctic zone goes hand in hand with an economic development and the accelerated militarization of this zone. Now, if we can come back a bit lower, okay. Another slide, please. All right. And here we have seen pictures of the Russo-Chinese military maneuvers and the American NATO maneuvers in the Arctic area. Here, this picture illustrates the American military maneuvers in the Bering Straits in September 2019. So if we come back to the map now, you see that the Bering Straits is in fact the entrance and exit of the North Sea route on the Pacific side. In other words, the U.S. Navy marked the fact that it was capable of acting at the entrance of the Bering Straits, where the Chinese convoys enter and exit the North Sea route. Can we see the next slide? Next slide, yes. Consequently, knowing that the Arctic warming has led to the Arctic death spiral, what is expected now is the moment when you will have a blue ocean. That is to say, you will no longer have ice cover on the Arctic. What happens then is that this immense ocean becomes navigable and becomes common both to Asia and North America. So what this means is that the forces of cooperation be stronger than the forces of dissent. Thank you for your attention. Well, I'm sure this is going to raise questions, especially with regards to the geopolitical balance, especially at a time where we are being brutalized from the geopolitical point of view on the European level. This is going to have some very damaging consequences on the equilibrium, the balance that we are very much attached to. We now have Laura Maanavilja, who is going to explain the attitudes of European citizens with regards to the question of clean energy. What you're going to do is talk about the consequences of climate warming on the geographic balance, which might be considered something that is established forever. But here, we are going to talk about the question of energy, and with regards to climate change, the transition to renewable clean energy. Another subject, in fact, that's going to have to be taken on by our citizens. Are you present, Laura? Yes, I'm present. I don't know whether you can see and hear me. Yes. So, good morning to everyone. My presentation is going to be in English, so I hope that it'll work.
To be here with you today, even if it's only virtually from Brussels. I'm also very happy to see that you are actually gathering together in a conference room with real people. I think this is a very welcome setting after the long period of virtual long-distance events only. I would like to thank the previous speaker for the great overview from a totally different perspective than what I'm going to focus on. I think this really illustrates the challenge that we are facing with the climate crisis and the transition to clean energies. It is such a multifaceted issue and problem that we are needing to tackle. It has all these economic aspects, geographical aspects, the geopolitical challenges, which, as we know, are even more pressing now than they have been in a long time. And what I would like to focus on today is the citizen aspect. And it is about how Europeans feel about this challenge and about tackling it. I will share some results of the regular Eurobarometer surveys that we do as the European Commission, and also some examples of initiatives that aim to get citizens on board of this transition, of these changes, and give them a say and a role in the process. I will try to share my screen here, and I hope that it will work. Can you see my presentation? I hope this works. So I will start with a quick overview of the European context. So what we have set together at the EU level is, of course, the European Green Deal as the direction of travel for our climate and energy policies, the target of climate neutrality by 2050. We also have the midterm target on this journey, that is the minus 55% emissions reduction goal by 2030 that has been agreed. And we have the whole set of legislation and policies that will help us get there. We have the climate law that makes these targets binding at the EU level. And we have the legislative framework, for example, the package of proposals to update the EU's climate and energy legislation from last summer, the so-called Fit for 55 package. We also have the different policies and initiatives around this agenda. One element to mention is very timely now with regard to the IPCC report that was just published this week that focuses on adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So we also have the EU adaptation strategy from last year that sets the framework of how we can work together as the EU on enhancing adaptation in Europe. But what we need to really bring all of these frameworks and strategies to life is making sure that the whole of society and all citizens are on board of this transition, because these will be big changes and they will affect everyone in Europe and, of course, in the world. Many people outside Europe are really in the front lines of climate change, but we are already seeing the impacts in the everyday life of Europeans as well. What I will move into is what are Europeans thinking about climate change? So these are some results from the latest EU-wide survey that we do every 2 years, a special Eurobarometer on climate change. The survey was done last year, so that was in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and we were quite curious to see how the European public opinion is looking at the challenge of climate change. What we see from the survey, which is done in quite an extensive way, we interviewed over 26,000 citizens from all EU countries and with a balanced representation of different socioeconomic groups and different countries. What we see is that more than 9 in 10 Europeans see that climate change is a serious problem. This is a consistent number with with the figures we have had in earlier surveys, and this share has been very high and rising over the years. I'm adding here also a result from an even more recent survey. This is from January this year, which was linked to the Conference on the Future of Europe, where actually around half of all Europeans saw climate change as the main global challenge for the future of the EU. So this is something that people across Europe really care about and are worried about. In the survey, we also ask, so who should do something about it? And here, people have different choices. The one that comes out on top is that national governments should take responsibility for tackling climate change, but that business and industry and the EU are mentioned as close second and third to the national governments. We also have quite a lot of people who think that there's a role to play for regional and local authorities and citizens personally. And actually, if we compare the results of the latest survey with the previous surveys from 2 years ago and 4 years ago, for example, the percentage of people who mention each of these elements has been clearly rising. So I think the perception of responsibility, of the understanding that different players in society have a role to play is getting clearer and clearer. Looking at the personal action, this is quite interesting. We have 64% of all Europeans who say, when asked, that they have done something at their level personally over the last 6 months for the climate. This figure goes even higher when we give some examples of what can be considered actions for climate, like reducing waste, recycling, using energy efficient appliances, using public transport, looking at your food choices. The top 3 actions that people are doing are related to waste and cutting down on disposable items, and also looking at the energy efficiency of things they buy for their home. So there clearly is an awareness of personal action, of the need for personal action, and at least people are saying that they are indeed taking this type of action. Where we also see a high level of agreement is on the benefits of climate action. These are just some examples. There are more questions that are asked in the survey on how people see the benefits of taking action for the climate. There are some examples here that are related to how climate action can help make European companies more competitive with innovation and technology. The second bullet here, I think, is quite interesting also in relation to the current context. It's about reducing fossil fuel imports and increasing our energy independence. And the third bullet is related to a topic also that I think has been rising in public consciousness, which is related to the links between climate change and health impacts that, of course, come even more visible when the impacts of climate change become more present in the daily lives of people across Europe. In the context of the challenge and of the benefits, Europeans expect that their governments and the EU should take more action than they do currently. We have a very large majority that agrees with the overall goal of climate neutrality by 2050. And a clear majority who think that at the moment their national government is not doing enough on this challenge. There is a majority in almost all EU countries who think that their government should be doing more. There's also clear support for ambitious targets for renewable energy, and for example, for providing support to improving energy efficiency and to the transition to clean energies. So people are in favor of reducing subsidies to fossil fuels and putting those investments in clean energies instead. This is a quick overview of the results of the Eurobarometer surveys. What I also wanted to share with you today is some examples of how this citizen angle is becoming closer to the policies that we are working on at the moment. As one element of the European Green Deal, we have launched what is called the European Climate Pact, which is really about this aspect of bringing people along and getting people on board. Because when we see the results of these surveys, we see that there is a lot of support in general, a lot of concern for climate change and a lot of support for ambitious action when people are asked about this question. But of course, what is a challenge still is how to turn this awareness and this concern into action, and how to make this huge global challenge more concrete in people's everyday lives. It will become more concrete because the policies or the targets that we are setting, the policies we are putting in place, they will have an impact on mobility, they will have an impact on housing. And I think where we really need to work very closely with people from all different groups in the European society is figuring out, what does this mean for me, what does this mean for us, and how can different people be part of this transition? Because they clearly have a role to play and they clearly need to be part of shaping this transition. And with the European Climate Pact, we hope to create a space for this kind of discussion and action. So it's a very broad initiative that aims to engage with different kinds of people. We have launched a few different strands of activities over the past year or so. And here are a couple that I would like to mention that I find very interesting. We have set up a network of volunteer ambassadors for climate. So these can be people who range from students to scouts to mayors to business people. And the idea is that anyone who has a commitment and who wants to do something in their community, in their network, can apply to become an ambassador. We bring them together at the European level, want to give them support, want to spread the message and help them work on their actions. Another way to participate is climate action pledges. We give the possibility for individuals to record their steps for the climate through a partnership with a global platform that's called Count Us In, that aggregates climate action steps from individuals. We also have organizational pledging where companies or other organizations can join in. We are exploring with different kinds of formats for citizen engagement. For example, right now we have a project ongoing on peer parliaments, which is about inviting people to get together in small groups to discuss specific topics and specific questions that are related to the transition to a greener society and cleaner energy. And we also have a youth engagement program that's particularly important this year, as it is the European Year of Youth. This is just one of the examples. So here I just put a couple of other examples because I think this is really a topic that is becoming increasingly important and increasingly part of many European initiatives. We have the Climate Pact, but there are many others. Climate issues and environmental issues are also an important part of course, of the Conference on the Future of Europe that is still ongoing. They are an important part of themes like the Just Transition initiatives. Here I just put a quick screenshot of an initiative that's related to involving young people in designing just transition programs. And as another example, we last year launched the new EU missions that are tackling big societal challenges. One of them is about carbon neutral cities, and one of them is about regions adapting to climate change. And the citizen engagement part is also a very important part of these missions and of their work to really bring the transition to the level of citizens, communities, cities, regions. So in a bottom-up way, in addition to the more top-down policies that are set and defined and developed at the European level. So this is what I wanted to share today. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after the presentations.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation
Thank you very
extrêmement
much for
précise
this
et documentée.
presentation, which was
Moi,
very
ce que j'en
precise
retiens
and
et
highly
ce que je voudrais
documented.
que vous ayez en
What I
tête au moment de
retain
poser vos
from
questions,
this,
c'est
when you
l'investissement nécessaire en termes
ask your
d'éducation et
questions,
notamment d'éducation
think
de la
about the
jeunesse pour
investment necessary in terms of
l'emporter,
education,
comme vous avez dit.
especially young people, to bring them on board, so as to obtain this very strong approval that you've obtained in your survey, where we see between 75 to 90% 90% of Europeans feel that it's important to do something in favor of the climate. And I think that a lot of Europeans feel that they have undertaken at least one action to fight climate change and to work in favor of climate change. So how to change this belief into an action, and how can we measure the results of these actions? It's important to have a means of measuring the actions, what they do. It's clear that year after year, the forecasts, the reports are becoming more and more worrisome. And I think that in your demonstration, Mr. Valantin, with regards to the warming of the Arctic region, the geopolitical consequences it can have, I think that here we see that it is quite clear that there is a real question in here. We cannot continue to say that things will come back to what they were before. So, following this demonstration on the planet level, then we saw a presentation concerning the commitment and approval of European citizens with regards to the urgency of the need to undertake actions. Then we can look at an application which is more a proximity one, because here we can see actions being carried out by a municipal authority, by a city, in fact, and the awareness of the need to act for climate. Noémie? Thank you for this introduction. Thank you to the speakers who spoke before me for their really interesting presentations.
First to tell you, welcome. Welcome to Paris. I hope you are enjoying your stay here and you enjoyed the visits yesterday as well for the members of the committee. So I will start my presentation. You can switch to the next slide just to give you an overview of where you are, where we are, and how we are organized here. So Paris, the city of Paris involves in its jurisdiction 2.2 million inhabitants in a metropolitan area of 7 million inhabitants and in a region of almost 12 million inhabitants. So I thought it was important to give you this overview first so that you locate in terms of government and in terms also of density of population where we are situated. So I'll switch to the next slide. So I'm speaking from the city of Paris and on behalf of my colleagues from the Directorate for Ecological Transition and Climate that was created a few weeks ago, that was born in January, and our role within the city is to coordinate its action and lead Paris Climate Action Plan, which I will tell you a little bit about, to design and implement cities projects for environment and for sustainable development, and as well to lead socio-ecological transition in the Paris resilience strategy. In that context, our role is also to ensure that the most vulnerable people are supported in this process, and we intervene in a few fields, water, air, energy, and some other ones. So cities are at the forefront to tackle climate change, and as we've just heard, if I understood well, 43% of EU citizens say so, and you can see in that presentation, in that slide, that in terms of tons of CO2 emission, the CO2 emissions, for instance, of Paris and Paris footprint are quite high, so we have a lot of leverages and fields, including transportation, food consumptions, on which we can act effectively on. You can switch. So we are facing today a combination of crises. This slide shows a range of different shocks that we have been facing in the past years, and also chronicles stresses that we are on a daily basis or in terms of more irreversible changes that we are facing. And all these risks, and some of you have compared and had a say this morning on the systemic approach, on the fact that crises and challenges are intertwined, interdependent. So we are on a daily basis and very concretely facing many types of challenges, among which climate change. So you can switch to the next slide. We have updated study on Paris in the face of climate change last autumn. And this study shows, well, first that, of course, as you know, climate change is real, and that we have known, just like the rest of Europe, the warmest year in 2020. You can switch to the next slide. And in this study, the average temperature, so it's localized, it's the impacts of climate change in Paris that have been studied more specifically. The +2 degrees threshold has already been exceeded in Paris, and as you can see, the average temperature is going to keep on rising up. So you can switch to the next slide. So it means that we're going to have increasingly hot summers and more tropical nights. As you can see, we can switch to the next slide. In terms of urban planning, it has a major impact. It means that these heat waves are going to have a more pressing impact on cities because of this effect that we call the heat island effect, that makes that the urban fabric, the concrete and mineral and asphalt-based fabric of our cities reinforces the impact of heat as it gathers heat and during nights it amplifies the impact of heat on cities and on public health as well. You can switch to the next slide. So it also means that climate change in Paris is going to mean less rains, but when it's going to rain in a much more intense and seasonal way with torrential rains as well. It also means that we're going to have much more needs for water in the city because of climate change, but it's going to be less and less available. And because of this phenomenon, the quality of water is also going to be a strong challenge in the next decades, more specifically between the 2050-2080 period. So we're going to have also more frequent floods, more droughts that are going to have social economic impact. Just for a centennial flood in Paris, an OECD study ranges the impact on GDP per capita up to 30 billion euros impact. So it could have major social economic impacts for the city of Paris, for the region, and for the whole national economy as well. Of course, biodiversity is also under much more pressure. So I'll go quickly because I want to show you some concrete action in Paris, so you can switch to the next slide. Just to conclude on this climate change adaptation report that was published this autumn, the main, what we learned was that the previous expectations that were published in 2012 about the impacts of climate change in Paris on 2050 have all come closer to 2030. So the phenomenon is accelerating, and action needs to accelerate as well in that context. So you can switch to the next slide, or it's a lot of connection needed. So to take action, Paris has elaborated an action plan, Paris Climate Action Plan, with 500 measures that was awarded last year by the UN Climate Award in the Climate Leaders category. So this Climate Action Plan, you can switch to the next slide, is setting many goals that I will come back to, but it's also inheriting from almost 2 decades of climate action in Paris that have led to more cycling paths, that have led to more public transportation, to energy transition action. I won't go into details, you have the numbers here, and some of you have visited yesterday some of the actions, and you've talked about cycling lanes, I believe, so we can switch to the next slide. The carbon neutrality pathway to 2050 for the city of Paris is this one. The first big step is 2040 with a minus 50% local emission goal. So you can switch to the next slide, and which means that the following targets are our own. So we need, for instance, to become a zero fossil fuel and domestic heating oil area, to diminish our energy consumption by 35%, of course to accelerate our action on air quality as well. So aside from these mitigation actions that are underway, there is also a very ambitious climate change adaptation strategy in Paris that targets to have a more resilient and inclusive city, to have at least 40% of the territory that is covered by vegetation by 2024, to refresh the city and to increase the role of water in the city. So you can switch. For instance, it means that one of the goals is to have a cool island closer than a 7-minute walk maximum for any Parisian. So a place where, in case of a heat wave, we can gather and cool down. And it's a matter of public health. And as you can see on the map, we still have some lacks. So we need to change the urban fabric to reach that goal. So you can switch, so which means that we're going to green the city. I'm not going to get into details of how many trees or green streets or green licenses we're gonna give. You have all this on the presentation, and we can switch. So to make water more visible and accessible to all is a very strong goal. I guess you have walked along the Seine yesterday. The River Seine should be swimmable by 2024 for the Olympic Games. So that's a major goal for us for the Olympic Games, but also much further away as a heritage, including if we want to refresh in 2050 and beyond. We also, in terms of urban planning, have a very ambitious master plan that is currently being discussed with Parisians, because Paris is a built city. We inherit from patrimonial cities. So the goal is to remake, in a way, the city in itself, because 90% of existing Paris will still be there by 2040. So the goal of this urban plan is to transform what exists, to have more green spaces and cool islands, as I said, and to develop a new housing offer to preserve the social mix, but also to build differently and to clarify the rules of construction in Paris. You can switch to the next slide. So in that context, one of the goals is also to bring the solutions, including climate action and climate solutions, as close as possible to the people in the realm of the 15-minute city, so that we can act as citizens. We can find close as are possible to our places, to our homes, and to our neighborhood, also the resources that we need in face of these challenges. So you can switch to the next slides. And this means that we also need to foster and facilitate citizen engagement. Today, we have 37,000 volunteers of Paris, which are citizens that have been engaged, that are engaged to effectively, concretely act for climate change. So they participate to training lessons, they plant forests, they are trained to help and to save other people with the basic gesture, etc. So they are trained to be effectively active and along with the city to act concretely. And I guess that you visited the Climate Academy, and the place we are here today is a perfect illustration of one very ambitious action that the city of Paris has put in place. So for this, of course, we need to leverage finance, and this will be a transition with the very last part of my presentation. Today, for instance, 20% of the participatory budget of the city is dedicated to climate initiatives, which means that the citizens themselves choose the climate action as a priority action in their neighborhoods. But we also have developed green bonds, the Paris Green Fund with some firms, and we also worked on green budgeting, because it's not only the finance and the funding part, but also the reorientation of the existing budget that is a challenge for us. So we can switch to the next slide, meaning that it's more in the design of the public policies themselves, in the way, in the lenses we put when we conceive, when we design public policies, that we need to tackle climate change and all the co-benefits that come with it. So in a way to be able to, with one process, one budget, one schedule, and one only process, to be able to reach as many co-benefits as we can in the action we undertake. And these challenges is, I wanted to give you one illustration, concrete illustration that answers to one question we had this morning. One of you said, I think it's in schools that we need to take action, so I thought this would be a good illustration. One of the key actions that is led today by the City of Paris is to transform the schoolyards. We have 700 schoolyards in Paris that are that some of them have been deserts of asphalt so far, so not really adapted to climate change. And the goal of this project is really to completely change the way we refurbish the infrastructure, including the way, you can switch to the next slide, the way we design it for climate change adaptation, meaning that we are going to green them much more, to have more permeable surface, to capture rainwater and store rainwater, and of course to open it very largely, and I'll come back to the people. Just wanting to say that this has been financed, this project was possible because, and thanks to, in a large part thanks to the UIA, Urban Innovative Action, so the European Regional Development Fund. So I wanted to also make a point that the European Commission can also help local governments act across silos and conceive and design better public policies in the way also it frames its call for projects and the way it funds also action for local governments. So this project that was initiated in Paris Resilience Strategy was also very specific. You can go to the next slide, because it means that it was designed by the children themselves. So what the specificity of the project is that each schoolyard is designed by the children that do little drawings and that imagine themselves their dream schoolyards. You can switch to the next slide. And these schoolyards are also open to the public on weekends and out of school time, meaning that it also allows us to reach one of our key goals in terms of resilience and climate adaptation, which is to fight against also the loss of social cohesion and to reinforce social ties at the local level. So to conclude and to show how this illustrates our holistic approach to public policies to tackle climate change, this project, for instance, is an opportunity to tackle with this one process, one schedule, one budget, a range of ambitions for climate change. So just final slide on the key messages I wanted to deliver. The first is that the City of Paris is committed to concrete climate action that is carried out together with citizens. And the second one is that a holistic and systemic approach is key for cities to effectively strengthen their resilience. Thank you very much for listening.
Merci beaucoup pour cette explication très dynamique
Thank you so
qui
much for
montre
this
bien
very
que la
dynamic
ville de Paris
presentation
a
that
pris
shows that
le
Paris
problème
has
à
really
bras-le-corps avec
taken
des
the
études
bull by
sérieuses
the
en termes
horns and done
de
some serious
mesures
study
du changement
in measuring
climatique,
climate
des
change and the consequences thereof for Parisians, but also by fixing objectives, short-term, middle-term, long-term, by shortening the agenda, as it were, as you explained, by basing this on the national and international events, because the Olympic Games and preparation for that is an important beacon to mobilize Parisians. What I really recall about your presentation is that this is a global project. It is a political project where you have to bring along Parisians in that, and children. It's really the demonstration of inventing the modern school and the school courtyard, which is wonderful, because it's to everyone's advantage. So you're training citizens of tomorrow, and you're enabling them to participate in the improvement of the quality of life of their parents and their grandparents. So it's a very consistent, coherent approach, perhaps sometimes difficult, because I'm from the suburbs. I know it's not always well accepted by the neighbors around the courtyard in Paris, but nonetheless, it was a very educational presentation of the program and this agenda with a dashboard that you showed us. So I think this will have a lot of people on board. So three very interesting presentations at different levels, which can really stimulate many questions, lots of thought, and perhaps can bring us to some conclusions that can be shared subsequently with respect to the EESC, because that will be a contribution of Group 3. Who'd like to ask a question? And to whom? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment to make on the presentation of the colleague from Brussels, from DG Climate. We got a lot of figures showing us that the citizens are ready to act and they want to do something. I just would like to remind all of us, 7 years ago, last week, 7 years ago, they set up the European Energy Union. And two main goals were, number one, reduce the dependency on energy imports. 7 years ago, it was main goal. Nothing happened yet. We are more depending on fossil imports than ever. And second goal was to put the citizens in the core of the policy, of the energy policy, to allow them to act, to become energy producers, not to get just an ambassador or something like that. So I think there is a lot of space to bring citizens really into action. And then I have a question to the presentation, really fascinating presentation just from Paris. I think I've seen that you said you would like to move out or kick out fossil energy sources for heating purposes. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, but if you want to do so, which would be great, what is it, new sources? How you like it to replace it when you kick out oil or gas for heating purposes? And a second figure, I have a question on, I've seen that you would like to install 50,000 square meters of solar panels. Well, is it impressive or not? 50,000 square meters in Brussels, in Paris is nothing. I've been a tourist this weekend, and I was on the Montparnasse Tower, and I looked around, and I see so many roofs. Is there any estimation how much electricity you could produce in Paris when you really install, or more or less on each and every roof which is available, solar panels? I think it must be an enormous amount of electricity you can produce by yourself. So is there anything in your climate plan?
Alors, si je comprends, on prend plusieurs questions ou on répond au fur et à
We're going
mesure?
to take several questions, and
On,
then
prend- on
we'll
répond au fur et à
respond.
mesure? Oui.
Should we
Donc,
answer
je
it?
pense que c'est votre question, elle s'adresse à
I think
Noémie.
your question was for whom?
Je la prends maintenant, la dernière. Thank you for the two questions in your question. Well, for the fossil fuels part, you've seen well. There's a whole in this trajectory. There is a renewable energy goal as well. So we are building cooperations with many different also neighboring territories around Paris, because as you've seen in the first slide, Paris is a city center in the middle of a much wider region. So we are building these territorial cooperations for renewable energy production and buying strategies. And in terms of roofs and solar panel, I'm glad you had an instructive touristic approach of Paris. Is it going to be enough? One of the biggest, so this topic is currently discussed in the realm of the new master plan, the urban plan. So there is no concrete action on how we're going to do it, because it will be set in the rules by next year. But which is a big challenge for us is that Paris roofs are patrimonial roofs. The Haussmannian zinc gray roofs are today classified as UNESCO patrimony, and so to put solar panels in all Paris roofs is a challenge that goes beyond energy production. It's an aesthetics challenge, it's a patrimonial challenge. So the discussions are not that simple, and the surface answer is not sufficient.
Est-ce que vous êtes satisfait de la réponse?
Are you satisfied with that response?
Bon, moi, je voudrais, pardon,
I would like
quand même apporter aussi
to
une
also
question, parce que c'est vrai
ask a
que
question.
Paris est une ville
Paris
patrimoniale,
is a very old city with buildings that were built over centuries, and it's not always easy to transform them, to transform the city to make it more accessible and more resilient. But nonetheless, there are buildings that are not adaptable. However, what's your strategy so that this type of construction, how will you proceed to get past the difficulty in energy consumption, which is too high in certain buildings, and how can these heritage buildings be included in your program and your agenda?
English. Indeed, there's a quite large range of built typology of buildings in Paris. There are these Haussmannian patrimonial buildings. There are what we call les HBM, l'habitat bon marché, so the red bricks that are all around the city. There are some more recent constructions. So every typology, every type has a different answer. So we have, of course, a quite ambitious renovation, building renovation goals, including in patrimonial buildings, which is not easy. And for roofs, for instance, the much recent the very recent buildings and housings, some of them have solar panels. We have developed with citizen cooperative solar panels on buildings, with Eau de Paris, which is the water management public firm. We have also developed solar panels on the different fabrics. So we have these partnerships with firms and with the private sector and the sector tertiaire. So the strategy is not only with public buildings and patrimonial buildings, it involves everybody with incentives, for every actors within the city. And in terms of materials we use, for instance, for renovation, there is also a big challenge and a goal to develop biosourced, much more biosourced chanvre, paille, I don't know how to translate chanvre and paille, in the way we refurbish the buildings and including the most patrimonial ones. And here, I don't know if you've visited the place at the Climate Academy, but on the first floor you have very concrete examples on how we can concretely use these materials. And the roof of the Climate Academy is also going to be, even if it's very patrimonial, transformed and hold a sub-roof platform to refresh, to give to green, and to give access to the visitors to this roof, even if we are in a former arrondissement city hall. So it's also possible.
Très bien, merci. Et je crois... Voilà, merci beaucoup. Et je crois que vous savez aussi que vous avez
Thank you very much. I think you also have a policy of insulation of older buildings as well, which would make it possible to consume less energy. So getting out of fossil fuels, it's not just not consuming it. You have to move on to something else and no longer use fuel. That is a real challenge. Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Chacun votre tour.
J'ai une question pour Monsieur.
I have a question for Mr. Valantin. With respect to the increasing defiance of countries in the world, with respect in the US and their failure, which was Afghanistan and leaving Afghanistan, and the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, should we expect a conflict, a worldwide conflict in the coming years between NATO and an alliance between Russia and China, where China does not have any direct, does not directly denounce the actions of Russia in Ukraine? So, should we expect a conflict, a worldwide conflict between these two camps in the future? Thank you for your question. I think we're getting a bit away from the topic about the geopolitical and climate as related to climate. In fact, I'm going to deform your question on purpose to reappropriate it in this context of this discussion. For example, a case study that you're using, the warming up of the Arctic and the way in which the Arctic is being developed economically and militarily, as it were. It really does demonstrate the geophysical changes that are ongoing, are bringing about both new forms of tension, geopolitical and strategic, but also new forms of cooperation. And that form of cooperation in the framework of Sino-Russian cooperation to develop oil and gas in the Arctic does not go in the direction of the energy transition that we just spoke about. However, on the other hand, we can also notice that since a year and a half now, since the election of Joe Biden, the question of the implementation of a Green New Deal worldwide is under discussion at a major scale. So in fact, what appears right now is a very strong tension between an international model founded on strategic competition and another worldwide model which is targeting an adaptation of the international community to climate change via adaptation, as I said. But there are three possible scenarios there. The first scenario is international community appropriates, it onboards the principle of the Green New Deal. Why not? It's not totally unthinkable. There are surprising examples that are starting to emerge. The second possibility is that the international strategic tension, which is stronger and stronger, could cause the possibility of a Green New Deal to fail. That's a risk. Or there might be a kind of a synthesis of the cooperation under tension, where the geopolitical tension between countries or groups of countries are not done away with, but however, the necessity for coordination between continents and countries to reduce the climate change and to adapt to it is necessary. It's not unthinkable either, to the extent where this model of cooperation under tension since 1948 has made it possible to avoid nuclear war since that time. It has enabled us to continue to prevent that. So, in the material that we're studying now, nothing is ever simple and nothing is ever linear, and there can be astonishing combinations of these solutions. What you're saying there can be based on the inquiry that Laura commented on earlier, the very strong onboarding of the great majority of Europeans to the necessity for a concrete policy in controlling climate change. This was an inquiry that was outside of all tension, such as we're having today. But the tension of the conflict in Ukraine, which is at the heart of Europe, in the heart of Europe, could, I'm sure you'll agree, could develop that requirement even stronger on the part of citizens, that the political people in charge be more responsible about this. It's something we're betting on. But it's a bet on democracy as well, and on participation of citizens. And if we carry this over to the demonstration that was made by the representative of the city of Paris, even in difficult situations, if you're onboarding Parisians and users on the scale of a city, we can bet that this type of onboarding of citizens in a requirement, actually, and for a reason of absorbing climate change, can actually come to fruition. I think that's what was meant to be said.
What I say is that cooperation at times of great tension is possible, but maybe there needs to be a greater involvement of citizens. You had a question, sir?
Yes, thank you very much. I also have a question to Mr. Valantin. Perhaps you already answered my question. Was that many things have changed in last week, and it seems that the world is turning around. And my question was to analyze to you that what is your analysis that what will be now ahead, the biggest change, what is happening, that we already heard Lutz represent that the dependence on European dependence on the energy imported is still very high, and for the Russian energy. Do you think that there will be now very rapid progress, for instance, in this field? And but you already handled a bit this part. Thank you.
C'est une question à un scientifique, pas un
This is a
devin.
question for a scientist, I think.
I introduced my presentation by saying that this week sees the collision between the Russian war in Ukraine with the release of the new IPCC report. And it reminds me of, how could I say, another collision in 1972. In 1972, the Club of Rome released its famous report, Limits of Growth, establishing that there were only 40 years left of resources on Earth to maintain economic growth. And the very same year, Richard Nixon met President Mao, starting the modern collaboration and economic interdependency between China and the United States, and thus starting the very strange economic driver that emits 45% of the world greenhouse gas emission per year. So what I think is that I agree with you. These days are days of very big shift. However, this shift are occurring in a very, how could I say, in a overeating international environment, overeating from a geopolitical and a geophysical point of view. And what we see is this very strange interdependency between Russia, European Union, and the need to take off from fossil fuels. The question is, in fact, and I think I'm going to go on the Laura and Noémie grounds. In fact, it seems to me that the energy transition paradigm needs a more developed social, how could I say, not a social agenda, a social model, okay? Because consuming less energy and producing energy in another way is going to entail very important social changes. And I tend to believe that there are lots more social researchers who should work about energy transition.
Faut conclure. Bon, mais c'était pourtant, là on démarrait bien.
Now we're really starting the real discussion now
cette obligation
with this need, in fact, to involve a new model rather than an agenda. I think that if the energy supplies from Russia can no longer be there, we're going to have to find some very rapid solutions. And here I think that the scientists, the researchers in their folders have maybe the premises of a substitution, because it's in crisis periods that the most innovative and adapted solutions are found. Obviously, I see someone who's pointing at their watch telling me it's time, but it's clear that this overheating period that you've described could be a piece of luck for our planet and for our society as a whole to find other solutions, and maybe the possibility of accepting them in an easier, more rapid way. And this, when we look at the very ambitious educational agenda we've seen, here there's a need, it's necessity. So it's up to the researchers, ladies and gentlemen, researchers, scientists, you need to work. Are you a scientific background? No. No. So she's an elected official, a local elected official. Okay. Anyway, so we have pragmatism on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to think. We need to think about what research is going to get us out of this dawning crisis. Thank you very much. You've been very clear. I'd like to thank our participants who was here virtually. Very interesting presentation, even if it did not raise questions, because what was said was very obvious. So I think that we will leave this third roundtable session with a better understanding and knowledge, and hopefully with greater hopes to be able to, our ability to get out of this crisis in the coming weeks and months. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask our president, Séamus Boland, to come back to the table to replace me for the conclusions to this afternoon's work.
Vous venez avec une autre personne? Voilà.
Okay, we will continue because I'm just thinking of time and being out of here and all of that. For the final session, we have one speaker, and I'd like to introduce him, Nicolas Berghmans, researcher on climate policy and energy at IDRI Policy Research Institute. And I'd like to just on your behalf thank Dominique for that last very interesting session, and which I think there was some serious discussion by the speakers on in terms of how we progress, and indeed a very refreshing presentation on how Paris, or maybe other cities like it, can be really reformed and refreshed, I think was the nice word she used. Noémie, she used a very nice, I thought refreshing was a much better word and more exciting. So, Nicolas, I would like to ask you to give your presentation.
Oui, merci. Je ne sais pas si j'ai mes slides qui sont connectés.
I would like to know whether my slides are ready. Yes.
Alors, c'est pas la première slide, si vous
That's
pouvez revenir
not
en
the
arrière.
first slide. Could you go back one, please?
On voit déjà les conclusions.
Thank you. We already see the conclusions. Well,
pour commencer,
just to start,
déjà merci pour votre invitation.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your invitation.
Je comprends que j'arrive en fin de.
I will not be too lengthy here. I know you've been talking here all day. You've discussed many subjects. What I would like to propose is that perhaps we have look back on the Fit for 55 package at the European level, and perhaps our view of what the challenges are for the EU to achieve carbon neutrality, and maybe the reason of existence of this package. On this slide, something you probably have already seen this, but it's something you want to bear in mind. And this concerns the long-term direction of this change, where we want to be as a continent in 2050, which is the objective set by the European climate law. I'd like to come back to the importance of these long-term strategies so as to understand the transformations necessary to achieve these objectives. What you see on this graph is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which would allow us to reach this objective. What we see is that all sectors have to evolve as of now. This is something that's very important and needs to be kept in mind, especially today when Europe is discussing concretely a legislative package, and this is something that's essential. In the next slide, I wanted to show you what this long-term strategy would imply, taking into account what will happen in the gas sector so as to achieve carbon neutrality or climate neutrality. You know, this is a long-term strategy. So this was done in 2018. So remember, at the time, we were looking at the earlier objective of minus 40% in greenhouse gas emissions. We see that with the minus 40% target, the objective was to reduce considerably consumption of natural gas by 2030, 20% between 2015 and 2030. I looked at the figures today, and we are dealing with 335 million tons of oil equivalent, which means that we have advanced very slowly towards the reduction of natural gas consumption. It's a real problem for the long term, because here, these are the two bars on the right-hand side. What we must achieve is a reduction of natural gas consumption divided by a factor of 6 or 9. Now, this is important because underlying these actions are the lock-in effects, because you know that in many industrial investments and infrastructure investments today, if we make the investments, we have to integrate the objectives. In other words, all of their new investments should have their place in 2050 with very little natural gas consumption and very little new gas vectors like biogas, synthesized methane, hydrogen, and this with close attention being given to the fact that the use of these gases will not necessarily be the same as for natural gas use. Some will be used in transportation, but not necessarily for heating purposes. So all of this to say that you need to keep this in mind when we look at the trajectory, when we look at the present crisis, when we look at the need for energy independence. Europe already back then had projects to improve its dependence on imported energy. Once we've said this, we know that the Fit for 55 package is made up of a legislative text and other documents which arrived in December concerning the gas market, concerning construction. I'm not going to list all of the measures. If we look at the new measures like the mechanism for carbon border, and adjustments, etc. So in my opinion, if we look at the reforms, there are four major challenges that we need to take into account for the transformations. First of all, we must remember that this package is an opportunity for Europe to create the favorable environment to break that dependence on gas. Now, to decarbonize industry, there are solutions which do not yet exist and which would cost more than the market. So, there are business standards and business models which do not yet exist. What this means is that with the price of this gas today, well, in this decade, we are still not capable of financing the model. That is to say that the price in the market is still not sufficient to implement certain things. For example, the use of hydrogen, you need 100 euros per ton. So if we look at the price of carbon in the last 2 days with the war in Ukraine, so we have to follow this very closely. It's not just because the price decreases, but what's important, you have to encourage this development through public markets. There are also the question of subsidies for initial projects. And so there is a political issue to develop the environment for these new solutions. The second point is clear and echoes what was said earlier, is that this package should be a possibility to align international trade to the needs of climate change. Recently, this alignment was very symbolic in trade agreements, etc. But with the carbon borders adjustment mechanism, which applies to certain industries, this could be an opportunity to raise the issue more concretely in the sectors concerned. What it means is that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is an important environmental issue. It must be perceived as a measure to fight climate change and not as a protectionist measure. So it means that we have to work to integrate the low-carbon industrial production coming from outside of Europe. We have to give them access to the European market, and this with the intention to cooperate with developing countries. We need to have these measures go hand in hand with cooperation, technological cooperation around these low-carbon solutions. For example, we could import low-carbon steel coming from other zones with technology from Europe, for example. The third point I would like to mention here, something you discussed today, which I think is extremely important, is that this package must lay the groundwork for a social base that is just and fair, with two social dimensions. First of all, regarding consumers who are the constrained or vulnerable customers who are exposed, in terms of the carbon markets that are linked to construction and transportation. In my opinion, it's important not to look at these carbon measures just from the point of view of their impact on carbon emissions, but also in terms of the income it can generate for the public authorities that can then be used to compensate the effects on the vulnerable. So it's not a question of saying that this is just a blank check for citizens. No, it could be, but I think it has to be oriented towards a public investment for the most vulnerable, those who will have the greatest difficulty in supporting, bearing up to increases in energy prices. So I think that we haven't discussed this too much yet, but that's an important dimension. Another dimension which I think is important is the question of those industries which today are dependent, economically speaking, on the use of fossil fuel. We know that Europe has tried to implement a number of measures within the Green Deal concerning a just and fair transition, setting aside coal. I think that this package, in fact, should be a time to ask questions and make resources available for that. I think that we're going to have to explain the approach to regions dependent on the automobile industry, the gas, the petrol industry, and it's important that we act at the level of these sectors. There's also the question of the agricultural transition in certain regions. This is very important because these are important elements in a successful deployment of a transition. When you have regions which have no prospects for the future, then it can be a real block. So, when we look at the prospect of switching from coal to other fuels, for example, the last point, and this is important, is that we must not do things only from the angle of climate. I think that's essential. In the area of soil use, we have to look at the question of carbon capture and sequestration in forests. This enables us to contribute to long-term measures because we will need these sinks, these carbon sinks. And if we envisage what is envisaged at the European level, incentives for these projects, and you have to have multi-dimensional criteria used. You have to take into account the climate issue, biodiversity, and the decrease in the soil use. So we have to orient the way in which soils are used, the way agriculture uses soils as well. So those are the four major challenges. I know that if you look at the actual report, it's a very long one, but if we look at all of the texts, you have a grid for reading these reports and understanding what needs to be kept within these packages. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. You are, of course, the leading researcher of the European affairs in the IDDI, and I think you present with us in that presentation a huge experience. And indeed, if you go on the website and see the publications he has written, I think they are well worth a read. Now, because of time, I will take about 3 questions only, so very quickly, if you want to put up your hands, do so. I won't wait for too long. There's the first question. Andres, if that's the only question, that's the only one I'll take. So Andres.
Thank you. Andres from Riga, Latvia. We are from different backgrounds here in the room, and we are all, I think, very positive about the things you said, and it was very interesting and insightful presentation, so thank you very much for this. Knowing that we are from different backgrounds and knowing you're a researcher, I must say I was a little bit surprised that when talking about things which are not directly linked with your content, you were very far from science and very far from reality. You mentioned Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is propaganda wording. It's Putin's wording. It is Putin's war against Ukraine. So my problem with this is that by being very, very imprecise and using, well, even propaganda terminology in topics which are not your topic, it decreases my trust also in the other topics which you are super competent in and which are super interesting. So this is more perhaps as a comment than as a question. Please, 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 let's be, as we have in this picture, we have science and culture, and I think its culture includes values. As we have night here in the picture, we have day over there, we have winter, which is the war, these heavy times we are in now, represented in this picture. Let's hope we'll jointly manage to get into spring and summer as represented in the pictures back there. This can be done only jointly by having a strong basis in European values in terms of energy issues, which we're talking about in this panel, but not closing eyes and being extremely imprecise in our wording when talking about other issues. So simply, sorry for being a little bit emotional, but it is wartime, and I think it is in our common interest not losing our trustfulness in the things where you are super competent in by using propaganda terminology in other wordings. Thank you.
Not just to reply, point taken. Honestly, it wasn't my aim to use badly this word. Maybe I talked too quickly on this, and I understand both the emotion and the difficulty of that could be if I'm imprecise in what I'm saying, etc. I totally agree with that. That said, and as you mentioned, point taken for my other presentations, and as you implied, it's also not completely my topic. I follow it like everyone else in the news today, but yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Interesting case. Yes, Simo, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Your last point, this soil management or the soil issue. Could you be more precise and open a bit if there's a time? What exactly you think about that?
Yes. So what I have in mind is what the EU is doing on incentives for carbon farming. So it's the discussion that is going on this. What I wanted to point is that now we have objectives of sequestration, which wasn't the case prior that, and these objectives will have to contribute to this minus 55% objective in 2030. And this will certainly lead to the establishment of certain incentives, economic incentives. So it's the case in the French, in France. It's probable that it will spread across Europe. And obviously, we need to make sure that it takes into account different objectives, not only the climate one. So projects that are financed through this mechanism are of a good quality and don't orient the use of lands on things that are adverse to biodiversity. One example could be certain kind of forests, for example, that are that could be encouraged by certain schemes, or certain agricultural practices in the carbon farming scheme that could endanger biodiversity too.
Thank you. And if there's one other, I'll take it. Otherwise, I will go into my concluding remarks. What a threat. Okay, it's getting to that time of evening. Okay, Nicola, I'd like to thank you sincerely for that presentation, because the Fit for 55 is indeed a program, the big program of the EU, and we need to learn a lot more about it. And as I said, I would divert you to Nicolas's work, because I think it's quite extensive, and to quote Andres, super competent. So I hope you do so, and I hope you give him a good round of applause right now. So, in terms of this conference, the first conference outside the Brussels bubble, if you like, in 2 years, what have we learned? It is on the topical subject climate change. We didn't know when we planned it that the week we would be doing this would be also a lot of more change than just climate change. And at the beginning of today, I set the tone of this conference in the frame of the war against Ukraine. And that war is in our heads. I was talking to you during the different breaks. That is the subject of our discussion, and it is the subject that is dominating the work of civil society. And I don't know how many people here have asked me to look at how we can do something to strengthen civil society and how it manages this incredible time in our history. Against that background, though, we saw some fantastic presentations. We saw that even in this war situation that we're in, that the war against climate devastation is equally there to be fought. We can't ignore it despite the difficulties, because if we do ignore it, we simply effectively make this century a loss, a write-off. And we can't really afford that. We had some young speakers here of different varieties, of different levels and different backgrounds. I'd like to thank you, because you're telling, as the younger generation are telling all of us, that if we do not deal with climate change, we effectively write off their futures as well. And we cannot afford to do that. So what Group 3 is going to learn from this is that we, having proclaimed a group statement back in September, will continue to pursue that statement and its effects. We will continue to allow and to advocate for civil society to have a say in different presentations, including the last one. We saw the advocacy of an alignment between civil society and the powers that are making the decisions. We continually cry out that the lack of that connection is the reason we have delayed so long. So Group 3 will continue this process. Can I now just turn to some basic thank yous? To the French delegation, Patricia Blanc, Rachel Bruchal, Chiara Carnaza, Joël Dustome, Dominique Gillot, who presided over the last workshop, Arnaud Schwartz, Lawrence Sellos, and of course, Thierry Lebert. Without you, yes. Very glad to hear that applause, because without you, I think we would have found it very difficult to organize this conference. I'd like to thank the Climate Academy, as I thanked its president this morning, for allowing us to be here in this excellent building, which Andres gave us some brilliant artistic and cultural remarks. It's a great building. I'd like to thank the staff, your staff, and the staff of Group 3 who are here today. Susanna, who had the enviable position of trying to keep things going and take charge. Sylvia, Yasmin, and of course, our head of unit, Fausta. Well done. When we sit down about this conference in a couple of weeks' time, we will have some thinking to do, because I think we had some tremendous challenges early on, and we learned a great deal. And I spoke about some of those things this morning. But I have to say, you know, when you have a hard-working staff who can turn around these challenges and make them happen and make this conference a success, we're very lucky to have them. And that's why I really enjoyed, in a way, the challenge this morning. So can I also finally say to the members and delegates here, my sincere thanks to you. Some of you expressed a view this morning and indeed yesterday. I wasn't sure if I could come. I wasn't even sure if it was the right thing to do. Of course it was the right thing to do. As Hélène Castro said this morning, sometimes you have to do these events to show two things. There is some normality, and Europe is progressing and moving forward. And if it's only just to share the common values within the European Union and within the committee and within Group 3, then yes, you were right to come. And I, for one, am very glad you did. So thank you sincerely. Finally, as John Comer often says, simply on your way out to give the badges in at registration, there's a box waiting to collect them. If you have time in Paris, enjoy it. Meanwhile, I will see you in the coming weeks and, of course, at the Group 3 meeting in March. Enjoy the evening. I hope you enjoyed the conference. You have a lot to think about. Thank you.